they don't actually have a vision of what cities should be like. Their belief system is the word local control. Regardless of what the results you get out of that, the cities have no powers under the U.S. Constitution. They only have powers that are delegated to them by states. That's it. The state can continue to let cities fail when it comes to housing and climate. But the state can also say, we're done waiting for you. You don't got this. You're not addressing the problem. It's just a race to the bottom to see which cities can be most exclusive. And the state can end that any time they want.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
Okay, we're back on the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards, and we're doing an episode to wrap up the Minnesota 2024 legislative session on housing and zoning reform. Earlier in the year, we did an episode with Chris Meyer, who kind of set the table and told us what to expect. So many ambitious, exciting things were on the table, and guess what? They all failed, right? Am I right that they all failed?
No, you are incorrect.
No? They didn't all fail? Okay, Peter
Wagenius,
Sierra Club North Star Chapter Legislative Director, a registered lobbyist, and Andrea Riehl from Neighbors for More Neighbors, State Policy Task Force Lead. I was discussing it with Andrea, and we decided, well, she knows for a fact she is not a lobbyist because she does not get paid. She's a volunteer. She does this for the love of the game, the goodness of her heart, to make the world a better place. Whereas, Peter, you're paid by the bike lobby. That's what you're doing.
Big bike absolutely pulls my strings. And Andrea doesn't have one of these. If you're an official lobbyist, you can get a card.
Really? Do they give you that? Who gives you that?
No, you can pay it's like $12, and it lets you into the Capitol after hours. Not like after hours, not like 3 a.m, but after 5.
If we're going to be showing off our badges. Look what I got.
Oh, there we go. Okay, dueling IDs.
Allowed to be here. I'm allowed.
Yours is nicer than mine. Look at that picture. That looks good.
That's so nice. Yeah.
So first, I thought we would celebrate nothing but good stuff on the 2040 plan. The legislature acted. We're calling it Comp Plan Clarity. And I hate that name, but I guess it was important for politics. We saved the 2040 plan, Andrea, Peter.
Yeah. By the way, the name was deliberately boring. There was a conversation at the Neighbors for More Neighbors event, and Sydney Jordan, our lead author, was there, and she's like, it's got to be boring. We met the first test. We found a boring name for a very important bill.
We didn't just save the 2040 plan, though. John, we saved comp plans across the state.
That's true. We saved the idea of any local government in Minnesota doing good things with their land use. All the things we're going to talk about later in the episode are just not possible. They can't be safe from people twisting environmental law to defeat it if you hadn't passed the Comp Plan Clarity Bill.
That's correct. Let me provide two small pieces of clarity. It applies to cities in the metro area. It doesn't apply to cities outside the metro area. That's one. And number two, as Jack Perry explained, it wasn't all cities that were threatened, because really only cities that include wealthy people were ever going to be able to file lawsuits against housing. So let's be precise.
Yeah, he went to the legislature and he's like, there's no problem with this. Only wealthy people can twist this law into an endless court battle. What's the problem?
That's right.
The second premise that's wrong is the suggestion that, oh boy, we are under threat from these mirror lawsuits. Boy, we're going to have these suits all the time. We started this December 4th, 2018. Over 5 years. Last count, over $1 million. It is not a general applicability statute because it's beyond the affordability of virtually anybody.
Yeah, he said it right out loud.
Right out loud, he said it.
Who else do we thank aside from Neighbors for More Neighbors and the Sierra Club? What a joy it is to live in a place. It's an honor to live somewhere where the Sierra Club is full of real environmentalists doing good stuff. But who else do we need to thank?
Well, I'll give you a quick list. So Andrea's group, Neighbors for More Neighbors and Sierra Club, are two of about 6 groups who were collaborating on land use reforms generally. The other partners are Move Minnesota, Isaiah, SEIU, and Minnesota Housing Partnership. And so between us, we kind of came up with an informal division of labor, and it fell to us as an environmental group to lead on comp plan clarity because it was an environmental law that was being abused against housing and against climate. But that group worked on all of the legislation, including comp plan clarity. And so we were more effective because we had I think, a really great coalition, and Sustain St. Paul became part of it as it moved on. Andrea, who else am I forgetting in terms of coalition members?
I think that's the main ones you mentioned. You said Isaiah, right?
Yep, those are the main ones in terms of the advocacy side. But really early on, it's critical to give credit to the American Planning Association and Alex Schieferdecker, because it was Alex who reached out to me, to Sierra Club, at the end of last session and after the end of last session to basically say, hey, Peter, I know other environmental groups didn't like last year's bill. Can we work on something together? Can you come up with an alternative that environmental groups can support, that the legislative leadership could support? Because last year's bill, died at the hands of both opposition from environmental groups and from legislative leadership who said this wasn't ready to go. So we really used the time in between last year's session and this year's session to get ready to come up with a proposal that a broad group of environmental groups could support. And it was at the request of Alex and the American Planning Association. And then from there, we built a broader coalition that added, in the end, 16 environmental groups. And most importantly, we brought it to the same people who authored the bill last year, Sidney Jordan in the House and Omar Fateh in the Senate. And they had exactly the reaction we would have wanted, which was, thank you for putting together something that could earn broader support. And from there, we really relied on our partnership, the authors, and also the committee chairs, Mike Howard in the House and Lindsay Port in the Senate. At different points along the way, they were really essential. And then at the very end, when the bill that we were including our language in kind of collapsed and there was no Senate omnibus bill, Aaron Murphy stepped in to find our bill a new home. So I'm sure I'm missing somebody and I'll be chastised for it later, but that's a short list of all the people who were needed in order to make this happen.
Peggy Sue Amihi Bean, president of the Minnesota chapter of the APA. Let's thank her too.
Absolutely. I should have mentioned. So Alex is the one who set this in motion, but Peggy Sue was the one. We testified side by side, Peggy and I, next to Senator Fateh in 3 committees in the House plus 3 committees in the Senate plus one more in the House. And there was a critical value to that, which is the other side were apoplectic in terms of presenting this bill as a plot by the city of Minneapolis. And we were determined, and I was really proud of our message of discipline, Andrea, we were not going to let them say that this was only about Minneapolis, because it's just bad strategy to say that only one city cares about this. It's not that it obviously isn't most important to the city of Minneapolis, because the city of Minneapolis was being sued, but we wanted to make the point, and Alex and Peggy Sue helped us make this case, that every city in the metro area is now looking over their shoulder, thinking, should we hire planners or should we hire lawyers? They should hire planners. And we were religious. At one of my presentations, I challenged myself to see in our 7-minute presentation how few times could I say the word Minneapolis, because we just wanted to make it clear. And Andrea, you had that great Neighbors for More Neighbors person who came up with not just examples but pictures of suburban cities who had built great examples of suburban density, smart growth, real smart growth. And that was key to our success in not letting anybody say that this was only for Minneapolis.
So I remember when Edina was doing their comp plan, they had a lot of opposition. And if you want to find a bunch of very wealthy people who want to oppose change in a comprehensive plan, Edina is like ground zero for that. So a place like Edina, they're not being super ambitious with their comp plan, but people still hate it and will sue over it.
Oh yeah, we had examples from Burnsville, St. Louis Park, Hopkins, North St. Paul, St. Paul. We had examples from all over the metro area, and that was super helpful. It didn't prevent the other side from saying, this is a plot by Minneapolis, but it made them look less and less credible as they continued to insist on that despite our Metrowide coalition.
Andrea, can you tell me what was in the comp plan, Claire? We've gotten this far in the episode. We haven't said what it did.
Yeah, it did some really important things, and Peter will keep me honest, but as you said, within the metro area, so the anywhere that's covered by the Met Council, it very specifically exempts residential density from being subject to the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act restrictions. So for comprehensive plans. So when a city builds their comprehensive plan and they say, where's residential density going to go? We're going to increase it here. We're going to increase it here. We're going to do, like in Minneapolis, they eliminated exclusionary zoning to allow triplexes everywhere. That type of density, we have all agreed now is not subject to an environmental review requirement at the comprehensive plan level. So individual projects still have to go through environmental review. So if there's a project that would cause environmentalists to be worried, they still have an avenue for that. But at the comprehensive plan level, when the city is just planning where things can go, that's been now exempted from environmental review.
We can no longer classify people as pollution. Is that a good way to put it?
I would say maybe more specifically that infill density in particular is better for the environment than suburban sprawl.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to, because I spent a lot of time with lawyers, I need to be a little bit more precise. The first version of the bill exempted residential density. The Speaker of the House and the chair of the State and Local Government Committee objected to calling out residential density by name. So the final version of the bill exempts comprehensive plans in their entirety from environmental review, but not from MIRA. But because we weren't 100% sure that alone would end the lawsuit, we actually did two things. We exempted comp plans from environmental review in the metro area, in MIPA, but we also explicitly exempted the current Minneapolis comp plan and the current St. Paul plan from MIRA in their entirety. So, the lawsuit will definitely end. Once
Jack Perry disagrees. It's going to go on forever.
Once Jack
Perry doesn't
say
done, what we all thought it said right up until the time it passed.
Yes, he hasn't completed the process of milking his clients for the maximum last dime in their pockets. But once that's done, cities will be protected in two different ways. And the reason and by the way, Andrea is going to correct me on everything else related to every other bill, but just related to this bill, it was really interesting and really educational for us as a coalition to realize it was the words residential density that were triggering for a number of legislators. I still believe that our first version of the bill that specified residential density, would have been the best version of this. Legally, they're the same. Legally, the lawsuit is done. And legally, cities are protected. But I think it would have been helpful to say the reason is because residential density is good for the environment. And that's what our initial bill did. And that's the argument we made that was ultimately persuasive.
Density is a four-letter word in local politics.
According to some, yeah.
At the end, so listeners, I want you to listen to the end because I'm going to ask Peter about his Jack Perry stories. He's got a family connection to a lawyer for big polluters and pretend environmentalist Jack Perry.
Sure.
So stay to the end. We're going to get into other housing policies that many of which failed this year that maybe will be taken on in the future. So let's start with what did we learn about statewide housing and zoning reforms in the 2024 session, Andrea?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we learned a lot of things. One really key lesson for me personally was how much cities really love local control. I think we learned that not just through the housing policy, but we even heard that post the Uber and Lyft things, that preempting cities on anything is something that we really have to work hard for folks to be okay with. And so that sort of framework of how do we come to an agreement with people about what a baseline should be statewide, what does that look like, really takes a lot of work in talking to people a lot about why it's okay if the state passes laws that sort of take some power away from cities.
Well, Peter, what do you think we learned?
Well, first of all, I would agree with Andrea completely. Local control is treated like a religion by certain folks, and at the risk of playing the gray-haired card, I've followed the legislature long enough to know that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats are the party of local control. They like it when it produces the outcomes they like, and they don't like it when it doesn't produce the outcomes that they like. And I think it's great that we are liberating people from that notion. There's no sentence more than this decision could be made at the local level that has excused all manner of sin, including blatant racial discrimination. I mean, what were Jim Crow laws except for Confederate states saying we don't want to be preempted?
States' rights is a rallying cry. It's a famous racist rallying cry in this country, and
exactly,
local control is the statewide version of states' rights.
Exactly, and we need to get away from this notion that decisions are good or bad based on what level of government made them. Decisions are good or bad based on how they affect people and their real lives and our planet and our future. And we need to get to the point, if we're going to keep making progress on climate, we got to not just put new ideas on trial. We need to put the status quo on trial. And the status quo of local control perpetuates racial segregation, perpetuates economic segregation, maximizes climate pollution. And the idea that we're just going to say, oh, well, too bad, the right level of government is making this decision, therefore it's the right decision? No, we're starting the process of breaking that crazy ideology.
So I'm going to lay out the wish list, a bunch of things that Chris Meyer brought to me on that earlier episode of the kind of things that were proposed this year, and maybe we can talk about what the status of that is, what happened to those this year. So things like legalizing 2, 3, 4, 6-unit buildings, reducing mandatory minimum lot sizes, parking reform, so reducing parking minimums. Was a single stairway reform also on the agenda this year?
And that one, we actually got something done on.
So. Oh, that's the one that went through.
Yeah, sort of, in a way. What we got was actually that DLI will study the safety of single egress buildings that are 6 stories and above, which I know is not exciting necessarily, but it's actually a really big deal. A lot of states have really struggled to pass single egress building reform because people have big concerns about safety, and they're sort of doing it against the backdrop of we just think it's probably not safe. And so what we're going to be doing here is starting with some data that we all agree on, that DLI is going to do a study about what does safety actually look like for single egress buildings. It's been done in really dense cities across the world, and even in the US. So I'm really hopeful that will be actually a really good, meaningful first step.
Are there any things I didn't mention before we go back and talk about them all?
We also were championing a land value tax pilot.
Okay. What's the status of that?
It did not end up in the final bill. Yeah.
So legalizing multi-unit buildings like duplexes, triplexes, sixplexes. What happened to that? So
we, the sort of missing middle bill, we got through 2 committees on both sides of the legislature. We did not end up having anything to bring to the final days of session. It sort of got to the state and local government committees and did not go any further than that. So the way that this works in the state legislatures, you go through committees, it gets passed out of them, and then once you have sort of something on both houses have a similar type of thing that will go to the either the full floor or to conference. It's a very simplified version of what happens, but we didn't get out of that state and local government committee. As we were just talking about local control, that's kind of where all of those objections really came to a head. So we had really strong conversation and really good debate even in the earlier committees on the missing middle work, but ultimately couldn't get past that barrier of local control.
What was the response to parking reforms?
So there was parking reforms that were included in the missing middle bill that would have, in a variety of different versions of the bill, would have reduced the maximum or the minimum requirement to 1, which is significantly better than many places have. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, it's already at 0, so it wouldn't have really affected the metro. But so that was included in that. So that sort of piece was there. We also had the separate people over parking bill that Senator Fate was championing, which got one hearing in the Senate and did not go any further than that. But surprisingly, there was a lot of support for that actually toward the end of the session. And so I can see there being a path forward for parking reforms in the future.
That's had such a big impact in Minneapolis. That's a thing every place should be doing. You don't have to put any money into it. You just have to tell people you don't have to build more parking than you need anymore.
Well, one thing in particular that was really hopeful about that, and it did come later in the session, but it was notably bipartisan in the public comments that were... Now, opposition can also be bipartisan. One of the things I've learned in my time at Sierra Club is a Democratic majority and an environmental majority are not the same. They're mostly overlapping, but not completely. But it really is notable that some very conservative senators who were in that hearing said, yeah, I don't know why the government should be telling developers and forcing people to build parking that the marketplace doesn't want. And that's what's interesting about this whole debate over all these land use reforms is they really scramble people's brains if they are just comfortable living in certain partisan expectations that Democrats are always supportive of any kind of government regulation regardless, and Republicans are always opposed to any kind of government regulation regardless. And what we've seen in other states, and I think what we're at least starting to see here, and that hearing on parking reform was a great example of this, is that you can make an argument from the right and the left in favor of, hey, why are we forcing parking on people? Either from an economically libertarian standpoint or from a housing and climate standpoint, the arguments, both sets of arguments work.
There's also a keep your government hands off my Medicare kind of dynamic with conservatives where they think everything that happens is the government. So if some building gets built, they think that's the government doing it. And I don't know. I don't know if that analogy was great, but...
No, you're right. And they both played out. But seeing a Republican Drazkowski and a Republican Jasinski, who is the keep your government hands off my Medicare, stand-in in this case, who was defending the ability of local governments to tell private property owners what to do with their property, it's still useful to see both sides of those represented within the Republican Party.
The legislative dynamic of the League of Minnesota Cities as the representative of local governments opposing something, well, all of these legislators have constituents in these cities and in all these places. And so why would they necessarily, if they're inclined to support this and think, well, I can get away with this with my voters will still support me if I support this. Why does it matter if local governments in the League of Minnesota is in opposition?
I'm going to let Peter take that one.
Okay. Well, so I will say that I think we're going to be successful moving forward if we recognize that it is both individual legislators who are concerned that their constituents won't support this because they bought into whatever fear tactics, and the power of the League of Minnesota Cities. It's not that everybody's constituents are good with this and only the League of Minnesota Cities is standing in the way. It is both. And I will say it is really notable to look at, this is why I'm hopeful that we can overcome both of these two impediments, is that there are Democratic senators in suburbs, and not just in suburbs, in swing district suburbs, like Lindsey Port, Aaron May Quaid, who were willing to talk about land use in the context of racial justice and climate emissions. And that's why I think ultimately we can prevail. But there are other senators, also in swing districts, who do worry about their constituents directly. The most toxic influence of the League of Minnesota Cities is they're not looking for a solution. They're just looking for outright opposition, and they feed those fears. They foment the opposition being expressed to those legislators who might not have gotten as far as Senator Port has, might not have gotten as far as Aaron May Quaid has. The organization that is most effectively ginning up fears of, the parade of NIMBY cliches, quality of life, property values, outsiders coming into our community. The League of Minnesota Cities perpetuates and exacerbates all those fears.
The downtown commercial tax base in Minneapolis is kind of cratering. And so one argument is we need to build up our residential tax capacity here. And so is that a dynamic that's playing out in suburbs? Is that going to be a motivator? Like, we need to add more housing because we're losing tax base in other areas, or not so much?
Yeah, I think it's probably less influential in the suburbs than it is inside cities. But it is still true, right, that affordability is directly tied to the number of houses that are available for people. And suburbs are not exempt from needing to have housing that meets a variety of levels of affordability needs. The sort of drive until you can afford it mantra of finding, both income in terms of where your job and things that you want to do are and where you can afford to live is just really not tenable for most people at this point, especially post-pandemic. I think a lot of people are less willing to have an hour-long commute to go to a city center. So I think that some of those dynamics are changing. It's less about where is the tax base and how do we just really get enough housing for the people that we have.
Here's the question about what is happening in other states. Have we looked into what other states are doing? Anything to learn from their experience? I went to the American Planning Association conference, the big planning conference in Minneapolis this year. And one of the themes from one of the discussions, the panel discussions, was all of these big ambitious housing and zoning reforms, they're all failing the first time around. And sometimes they're failing the second time around, and sometimes they fail the third time around. But like, the idea is you're just going to fail at first. Are there other things to learn from what other states are doing? Like, what's working?
Yeah, so we and Neighbors for More Neighbors were part of a network called Welcoming Neighbors Network, which is a bunch of YIMBY type organizations in a variety of different states. So we paid a lot of attention to what other folks were doing this session, and Peter can tell lots of stories about the transportation story about how long it took us to get some really meaningful transportation reforms done. That was in Minnesota. That was a long haul, and I think land use is going to be a really similar thing where we need to change people's hearts and minds over time. But there's also, some urgency around we need to be doing this now. There's a big shortage of housing, and there's a big climate issue that we're all facing, and so we have these sort of joint needs that are coming to a head. But some of the things that we learned from other states were things like what we did this year. Like, we put a lot of ideas on the table as a first sort of crack at things, and really learned a lot about what was and wasn't successful, where the sort of balance of power was and wasn't. And we'll take those learnings and go forward.
I would add that, first of all, I agree with the strategy that Andrea described. I'm glad we put on the table a package of bills. I never expected most of them to pass this year because you're exactly right. It takes multiple years to pass these. And Speaker Hortman spoke to us pretty frankly after the demise of the missing middle housing bill, saying that was part of the reason why. That is just new for people, and you need to take time to bring people along. And And so that was always going to be part of the dynamic. And by the way, we're not done putting ideas on the table. In addition to missing middle, land value tax, all the things that Andrea mentioned, a bill specifically to add even greater density next to transit lines is going to come at some point. And bills that require the Metropolitan Council to actually do their job as it is commonly understood, I think will happen at some point. People think the Metropolitan Council's job is to contain metropolitan sprawl, to stop metropolitan sprawl. That's not what the law says, and that's not how they treat their jobs. The law says they are supposed to manage growth in an orderly and economical way. Orderly and economical way, and the law hasn't been updated in 50 years. Well, you can pave the road to hell in an orderly and economical way. You could destroy the planet from a climate standpoint and maximize our emissions in an orderly and economical way. We need to actually add new values into the mix, like sustainability. That was part of what the original version of Comp Plan Clarity was meant to do, and we had to lose those pieces in favor of keeping the pieces that ended the lawsuit and protected other cities. So I'm really glad that we put an aggressive agenda on the table, and that is definitely one of the lessons from other cities. I would just make one other observation, though. I think we're in a kind of a sweet spot to deal with this issue in a really thoughtful Minnesota way. Housing is very much an issue here, but not on the Seattle or Bay Area sort of scale. If we put thoughtful policies into place, we can build a lot of housing, we can grow in a sustainable way, we can contain metropolitan sprawl, and it doesn't need to freak people out in the way that the fearmongers want to project. Minneapolis does not need to become Manhattan. Maple Grove does not need to become Minneapolis. We just need policies that actually value things like equity and sustainability, and we can grow our way into a better future. So we're taking inspiration from those other states in a lot of ways, including the willingness to work on this as long as it takes.
Another theme I heard at the planning conference was building a big, broad coalition of groups, not just the housing groups, but the environmental groups, housing affordability people. Are we ahead of the game on that? I feel like we do have a big, broad coalition of supporters. So we've checked that box, maybe?
One of the things I'm most proud of is how broad our coalition was this session. Peter mentioned all of the list, but yeah, we had labor, we had transportation, we had YIMBY groups, we had climate groups, we had builders. So we were sort of all in the mix and really trying to come together and bring some good ideas forward. So we really have started with a broad coalition that shares the values of expanding opportunities for people.
Multiple legislators commented on being surprised at the size and breadth of our coalition. It's worth noting, though, that the opposition of the League of Minnesota Cities is also predictable from other states. I was listening to a podcast with Jessica Bateman talking about the Washington State experience. She's a legislator who led on their missing middle bill. And she said their equivalent of the League of Minnesota Cities got on board 10 days before the bill was going to pass. It was because they saw it was going to pass anyway, and only when they saw it was going to pass without them, that they came to the table. And that's the size of a coalition that we need to build. I used to be at the city of Minneapolis earlier in my career, and when I was at the city, we always kept the League of Minnesota Cities, we had a tense relationship with them because they were so much more conservative than we were, so much more conservative vision than we had of Minneapolis. And we need more and more city leaders to take an independent stand from the League of Minnesota Cities, because they don't, I said vision, they don't actually have a vision of what cities should be like. Their belief system is the word local control, regardless of what the results you get out of that. And one of the things that I learned when I was at the city of Minneapolis, there was a city attorney who educated me really early on and said, Peter, the cities have no powers under the U.S. Constitution. They only have powers that are delegated to them by states. That's it. If the state chooses to continue to let cities fail when it comes to housing and climate, the state can continue to let cities fail when it comes to housing and climate. But the state can also say, we're done waiting for you. You don't got this. You're not addressing the problem. It's just a race to the bottom to see which cities can be most exclusive. And the state can end that any time they want, because it's not handed down by the idea that the city gets to decide land use with no minimum standard, that's not handed down by God. It's not in the Constitution. The state can reverse this, and we take inspiration from the other states that have recognized this and finally established a floor under which cities can't go.
There's maybe a political question. If you raise it to the level of like a statewide question, does it become less of a not in my backyard thing because it's a thing that applies statewide? Maybe I can see the logic of allowing this everywhere in the state because it's not the immediate question of, are they going to destroy what I love about, being able to see downtown from my backyard? Is that like, does the politics become easier when it's a statewide question?
I think that personal politics become a little easier. We definitely found that the legislative politics aren't necessarily easier on the statewide level.
I think as long as we recognize that different parts of the state are different, a statewide push is helpful. Having bills that address housing in different parts of the state is really crucial. But we can't assume that every part of the state needs the same solution. There's lots of parts of the state where zoning is not standing in the way of housing because they don't have enough economic activity to make that a problem. But in the Twin Cities metro area, it's obviously a problem. It's a problem in Rochester. And this is another thing you see across the country. It's in the places with the greatest amount of economic activity where the gap between the need for housing and the supply of housing is the greatest. So as long as we recognize that we can't just have uniform policies that apply exactly the same way statewide, we can nonetheless try to address whatever problem is standing in the way of housing in different parts of the state. And it may be different in different parts of the state. But I think in one respect it does, and I'm going to be really aspirational here, and you should push back on this, but you think about the Minneapolis 2040 debate. Now that that is over, I would like to believe that some people would recognize, regardless of what side you were on in the Minneapolis 2040 debate, everybody in Minneapolis benefits from a Metrowide approach to this. If you think that the burden of addressing, if it is a burden, I don't think it's a burden. If you think the challenge of addressing housing supply shouldn't be addressed by the city of Minneapolis alone, well, good, then come on in. Come on in and be part of the coalition to recognize that a metro area problem should be addressed on a metro-wide basis. We used to do this, by the way. We used to have, there was a livable communities sub-caucus of the DFL, and at the state convention, we were asking candidates for governor to address metro-wide housing and metro-wide transit with metro-wide solutions. But we've had so little trifecta in the last 20 years, we've almost forgotten that we can do things that way. And one of the best things that is happening because of this coalition is we're being more ambitious. We're actually saying, no, we're not going to address this one city at a time, which is crazy. We are going to expect metro-wide and statewide solutions. That's actually how the last conversation about the formation of the Met Council played out in the 90s. We were all focused on metro-wide solutions, and we're finally getting back to that.
One sign that the politics may be getting easier is that when they tried some 2040 style reforms in St. Paul, they just kind of happened and no one threw a fit. Nobody sued over it. Come on, St. Paul, where are your wealthy pretend environmentalists? Were they so distracted by Summit Avenue that they couldn't manage to sue over a duplex?
Maybe it was Summit Avenue Jiu-Jitsu. Maybe the whole idea was we're going to freak the wealthy people out over Summit Avenue, and they're not going to notice that we're making an equitable, more sustainable St. Paul.
It's like on D-Day when they pretended to invade on a different beach, and then all the action happened at Normandy. Look at me making a World War II
topical
reference.
And timely reference. Yeah.
Absolutely. All your viewers who are in their 90s are going to really appreciate the reference you just dropped. The D-Day reference.
Yes. So when you mentioned climate as a factor, Peter, for the Met Council, like introduce it, so they did that with MnDOT, right? Like it's now a factor in transportation planning.
Yes.
And so the idea is let's have that as a factor with the Met Council?
Absolutely. Met Council should be embarrassed that MnDOT is ahead of them in certain regards. And MnDOT, to their credit, is seeking more flexibility in terms of how they spend their dollars to be able to spend them in more sustainable ways. We should help them do that. The bill you're referring to, just to be really clear, was led by Move Minnesota and Katie Jones, working with Representative Larry Kraft. We call it the climate impact of highways language. And it says that they can't build projects that are going to push us outside our greenhouse gas and vehicles miles traveled goals. And if they propose projects that are going to violate those goals, that are going to push us above them, they have to change them in order to meet those goals. And they even improved that bill this year, again, thanks to Representative Kraft, Move Minnesota, Katie, and others, to apply to more projects. So if MnDOT can do it, what do you think, Andrea? I think we can expect that of the Met Council. We should be able to, but
it seems
not
like
yet.
we should be able to, yeah.
So a political question, another theme from the planning conference I went to is should there be big bills that have everything in it, something for everyone, or should this be done piece by piece, separate it all out, one thing at a time kind of thing? Like, Andrea, do you have an idea of what the correct answer is? I didn't get the idea that like planners have settled on the idea that there's a correct answer for that legislatively.
You know, I think that having conversation about different ideas individually sort of early in the process is great, but the benefit of putting things together in an omnibus type package is that it allows you to bring more stakeholders on board who either would have had no opinion about something or might have even been mildly opposed to something, but it's packaged together with things that they are really care about. So strategically, I think there's benefit to sort of doing a both and approach here, where you're having the conversation in a real way on individual issues early in the process, but putting things together toward the end, I think makes a lot of sense to just get things passed. Also, we saw how hard it was for them to get even the big bills passed. If we were trying to do that a million times over, I'm not sure that we would have had any bills passed this session.
Anything to add, Peter, on that? Or
I would agree. It was both and. Having individual bills so they can get individual hearings and individual attention is great, but some kind of combinations. I mean, in the end, let's say we put forward 6 bills and it becomes clear that 3 of them have a path forward and 3 of them don't. Well, 3 of them end up in the omnibus bill and 3 of them hang back and we push them another year. There wasn't a vote on the floor on comp plan clarity alone. Comp plan clarity ended up getting merged into the transportation, housing, and labor bill. And so being nimble about that, with what Andrew described as both and, I think is the smart path.
So does it matter if the DFL loses control? I know it matters in very large ways, but like for housing and zoning reform, is it really realistic that Republicans will come on board for some meaningful stuff? We talked about this a little bit, but
most states that have passed meaningful land use reform have done it with a bipartisan coalition of people that are very interested in like property rights and keeping government hands out of how many houses you can build on your property, and people who are more interested in the climate equity play. That nationally has been the story, that it's sort of a strange bedfellows type of coalition. Minnesota likes to be different in many ways, and so whether the politics will work for us in that same way going forward or not is, depending on what happens to the legislature, is really to be seen. But we had some Republican co-authors at the very beginning of this process on the missing middle bill.
Did they drop off? Why did they drop off?
Some of the things that they were most interested in around aesthetic mandates and some other things ended up getting removed from the bills at certain stages, and so they dropped off at the end. But
I think one way in which Minnesota might be exceptional to what Andrea just described, and I agree with it in terms of total votes, but in most cases, Montana being the exception. They had bipartisan support for bills that passed within the context of a Democratic trifecta, with the support of Democratic leadership. And we don't have support of Democratic leadership yet. I mean, there's a MinnPost article describing Speaker Hortman's feelings about this, and she made it pretty clear to us, you all have work to do to earn her support and to earn the support of members of her caucus in swing districts. So I think it is possible to achieve, using Washington as an example. But the reason they were able to get a few Republican votes, more often from low-wealth districts, to make up for the loss of a few Democratic votes in high-wealth districts, the reason they were able to do that is because there was a Democratic speaker or a Democratic majority leader who was moving the pieces to achieve that objective. So I think we should embrace bipartisanship as far as we can get it, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. If we actually lost control of the House of Representatives, this bill ain't going anywhere. A Republican speaker is not going to facilitate this bill. And I'll just put on my broader Sierra Club hat for a moment. When you look at these past 2 years, the 100% clean energy bill, the breathtakingly visionary transportation bill from Dibble and Hornstein with both transit funding, bike funding, heavy rail to Duluth, climate impact of highways. When you look at that in combination with everything else they've done, there has never been a majority more worthy of re-election than the current DFL House majority. And I say that knowing full well they are not where we need them to be on land use reform yet. But we have to keep them because I guarantee a Republican speaker is not going to... The thing we want, let me say it this way, the thing we want that could earn some Republican votes in the House and the Senate needs to come to a vote on the floor in order for that to be made real. If there's a Republican speaker, none of it ever comes to a vote. So it doesn't matter that there were 10 Republican reps or 5 Republican senators who were willing to vote for it because the vote never happened.
Thank you for resetting my expectations that, like, yes, all hope is lost if the Democratic trifecta isn't maintained.
I'm here to keep it real for you, John.
It was true all along, fooling me into bipartisanship. So have we accurately captured the key points of this year's session? Are there any other themes that we should talk about before we tell our Jack Perry story? Don't turn it off, listeners. We're going to tell the Jack Perry story.
I hate to keep bringing it up, but we really did have a land value tax as part of the tax bill all the way until truly that midnight shenanigans that was happening, and that it would have been a pilot in either Minneapolis or St. Paul for them to sort of try that. But when we think about some of the things you were mentioning earlier, John, about the need for downtown spaces to be less commercial and more towards housing, something like a land value tax could be really transformative in those ways. And so I'm hopeful that our tax queen in Representative Gomez will continue her fight to get that done, and that we'll have something in the future on that.
I have a question about tax queen. Is that that was a chant at a political convention, right?
I think it was something that had happened before that, but yeah, I think it happened at the 61 convention. Was that people asking for more taxes, or was that just a title, I'm the tax queen? I think it was a title given to Representative Gomez. Yeah, I don't think she demanded it. I think it was, not that she's going to raise taxes, but just that I am the tax queen, or she is the tax queen. She's thoughtful about how she approaches tax issues as the chair of the tax committee in the House. Okay.
And has developed a real expertise both on subject matter and negotiation. She was also helpful on comp plan clarity. She's a force. Okay, Peter, the Jack Perry story. We went on a bike ride yesterday, a group bike ride, and at the end, you're like, I have a family connection to lawyer for big polluters, Jack Perry, who was the guy behind the anti-2040 plan lawsuit from the pretend environmentalists.
and you told me, and your dad used to be a lawyer.
Yeah,
right?
so
For the Pollution Control Agency, he worked for the government as a lawyer.
he was an attorney. So he's a community minister at a church now, and that's his second career. But he was worked for the Attorney General's office for 29 years, and for about 2 decades of that, his client was the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So he faced off against polluters in court on a regular basis, and the reason that I became aware of this connection. You said family connection. I just want to make it clear we're not related. But Jack Perry came to City Hall at some point. I don't remember exactly who he was representing, but he made a point of saying, "I know your dad," something, in this, happy sort of way. And, when your parents are in the environmental world, you get used to that. But almost everybody else says, "I worked with your dad." And he didn't use the phrase, "I worked with your dad." He said it just enough for me to think, I'll bet you were on the other side. So I called up my father and I said, "Do you know this guy?" And he said, "Absolutely. He represented the feedlots. He was always on the other side. Him and his mentor, they were always on the other side." So to be clear, it's not that I didn't already know that the other side were fake environmentalists, but when you hire somebody who regularly works for polluters, who constantly faces off against the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, my father in particular, don't ask me to be surprised or don't be surprised when we don't take you seriously when you're just doing an anti-housing lawsuit and claiming an environmental motivation.
One of the great joys of watching all the hearings on this bill to save the 2040 plan and to save comp plans generally was all the terrible, awful, no good Republicans making common cause with our city's pretend environmentalists, like beating up on Minneapolis and what we did, and saying, and like some of their best friends in the legislature in these committee hearings were the Republicans. Like
Peggy Scott.
Yeah. And I'm sure the people behind this lawsuit are like actual Democrats. I'm not going to say they are also Republicans, but how does that not make you feel very queasy when your lawyer is the big polluter lawyer and all your friends in the legislature or most of them are Republicans? I don't know. I feel bad.
And if people haven't read it already, Jerusalem Dempsis wrote a great story about this where she's more generous than I am, and she recognizes that there are people who are motivated by the environment and who may start from a position of opposing density in already developed cities. But she describes in that article that the one group that was a part of the lawsuit that genuinely could be described as an environmental group pulled themselves off the lawsuit because they felt that queasiness that you just described. They looked around and said, "Wait a minute, why am I in this room with these people making these arguments?" And they connected with current research, which has developed over the past 20 years, and they pulled themselves out. So it's not that I think anybody who ever considered being against this is automatically a fake environmentalist. But how long does it take? How many Jack Perrys do you need to hire embarrassing you before you stop and ask yourself, hey, maybe I should look into this. Maybe I should consider that 20 years of research has actually taught us something. So all credit due to the Audubons of the world who felt that queasiness and reacted to it, as opposed to just sitting within their priors.
Andrea, do you have any embarrassing family connections to terrible people that you can reveal?
Well, I'm sure I do, but I'm not from Minnesota. I'm a fairly recent transplant. None of my family's here, so sadly, no equivalent stories to Peter's claim to fame here.
Do you have either of you have recommendations, things that you're enjoying in your life that you would like other people to start experiencing? A book, a place, a movie, a video game, entertainment of any kind? Andrea, you have ideas?
Yeah, last summer I really got into group bike rides. It's a great way to meet people, have fun. So I highly recommend the Joyful Riders. They do a ride from Fulton Brewery. I think it's the second Thursday of every month. They do a lot of DJ rides, so DJ Eric Dev will be out there DJing, and it's just like a really joyful, fun experience. So even if you're not super comfortable riding your bike on the street, a group ride is a great way to do that because you'll be surrounded by people. So highly encourage people to seek out some group bike rides.
It's a great place for new riders because it's completely safe and protected, and you'll have so much fun. Peter?
Just because it's fresh, for people my age, Gen X, or maybe younger, there's this new, is it Netflix? There's a series called Girls 5 Eva, which is about it's basically, what if you checked in with the Spice Girls 20 years later and they were middle-aged and trying to make a comeback. And the woman who is like the lead singer is actually Sarah Bareilles, if I'm saying her name right, who's both an incredible singer and it turns out a really funny actress. It starts slow, but it's got all kinds of great like retro humor making fun of culture from the 90s and aughts, and it's worth checking out. Girls
Peter,
5 Eva, not
Girls
4
5
Eva,
Eva.
5 Eva, because there
I'm
were
assuming
5 of them.
was it called Forever and then they got older and then they added a 1 because
No, it was called 5 Eva in the beginning, and they stuck with it even after one of the 5 died, and it's a running joke.
No spoilers, Peter.
No, it's in the first episode. It's
okay.
It's worth checking
What
out.
woman in your life, Peter, forced you to start watching that, and now you learned you enjoy it now?
That would be my wife, who is 10 years younger than me, and 9 years younger than me, and so what is that? 42 or something like that. If you remember the Spice Girls existed, that is all you need in order to find this premise hilarious.
Okay, well, thank you for the couple of great recommendations here at the end. Thank you to Peter Wagenius, Andrea Riehl for coming on. Thank you for your victories at the legislature this year. Very meaningful, very good year we've had. And this has been the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. Thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.